The big three-way offensive operations of the Ukrainian army, including Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Crimea, greatly disrupted the Russian invasion plans, especially in the last days. The breaking moments in the Novogeorgiyevka front line in Zaporizhia Oblast resulted in the Ukrainians saving 7 settlements. With the liberation of these cities by the Ukrainians, the Russian troops in the south of Zaporizhia Novogeorgiyevka began to flee towards Novogeorgiyevka, Staromaynsky, Vladimir and Novogeorgiyevka. The Russians took their last breath in Staromaynsky, which is located in the south of Mankivka. In addition, the settlement of Oruzgan on the eastern side of the city turned into a center of deployment for the Russian troops fleeing from Novogeorgiyevka. On the other hand, another axis of attack of the Ukrainians was rapidly advancing southwest of Novogeorgiyevka. Russian troops in Novogeorgiyevka and Livadiya, which were among the 7 settlements liberated by the Ukrainian army, were completely pushed out of these areas. When the Russian troops who were completely out of the game between these two cities had no other option, Moscow turns its attention to the soldiers who fled to the south of Makharovka. This Russian group was holding defensive positions on the Staromaynsky axis, as we mentioned. But the Ukrainian army's assault brigades, infantry units, and tank brigades of M1, Bradley and Leopard 2s were heading towards the Russians who were standing on the Staromaynsky and Oruzgan front line. In fact, even Moscow was waiting for such an offensive operation because it was impossible to stop this. The Russian troops, whose defense collapsed to Oruzgan, were almost waiting for the Ukrainians to come to the city and declare war on them. Finally noticing this gap recently, the Ukrainian assault troops arrived in the city of Oruzgan and launched an unbelievable attack on the Russian forces in this front line. While the Leopard 2 battle tanks were advancing with artillery attacks in Oruzgan, the Ukrainian infantry units were hunting the Russians from the land line on the safe route where the artillery fire took place. After long hours of fierce clashes, the Russian troops in Oruzgan were compelled to raise the white flag, and as a result, the Ukrainian armed forces liberated Oruzgan from the Russians. With the liberation of the city, the number of settlements cleared by the Ukrainians from the Russians as part of the Zaporizhia offensive operations increased to 8, with the 8th settlement on the Zaporizhia front line cleared of Russians. The resistance. Russian military groups in this area were either destroyed during the Ukrainian offensive or fled from the clash area. It was claimed that the fleeing troops were now heading to the southwest of Staromaynsky because Russia has defensive fortifications in this area up to the city of Romica. But these defensive fortifications are not strong enough to withstand the offensive operations of the Ukrainian troops. If the Russians are not able to direct reinforcements to these rescue areas, it would not be a surprise if the Ukrainian forces advance as far as Romica. In addition, the way to attack Romica from the northern line is gradually opening as the offensive of the Ukrainians still continues in the direction of Rivne. These offensive operations are also supported by Ukrainian troops in Novogeorgiyevka and Lavagna. Since these two cities were liberated, Ukrainians can also easily reach Rivne from the west side. Moscow, on the other hand, remains silent after repeated Ukrainian victories. Even some Russian bloggers and pro-Moscow war analysts are aware of the critical situation in Zaporizhia, while Russian leader Vladimir Putin and Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu still ignore the advance of the Ukrainian army in Zaporizhia. Ukraine's Deputy Defense Minister, Anna Maliar, states that Kiev forces are still carrying out counterattack operations in at least 3 directions. In their latest statement, Mali announced on Telegram that it has gained between 650 and 1,600 FT in sectors of the Bakhmut front line in Donetsk Oblast, Ukraine, and between 980 to 1,150 FT in parts of the Zaporizhia direction. The Ukrainian Tavria Forces Group stated that the troops advancing in the direction of Zaporizhia are critical in complicating the Ukrainian attacks on this part of the front and prioritizing hitting Russian electronic warfare systems. In addition, the Ukrainian Tavrisky group of forces noted that the Kiev forces continued their counterattack on the northeast, northwest, and southwest outskirts of Bakhmut. Ukrainian and Russian sources reported that clashes continued in the west of Donetsk, especially around Makharovka and west of Zaporizhia. Anna Malayer, on the other hand, explained that heavy rain and bad weather did not affect Ukraine's progress as Russian mill bloggers reported. But some analysts believe it's too early to assess the effectiveness of the Ukrainian counter-offensive, which began last week. But if we consider what has happened so far on the Zaporizhia-Donetsk front line, we are faced with the fact that it may now be possible to say something. While not conclusive, these critical facts indicate that the Russian defenses are slowly collapsing on the Ukrainian southern front lines. Russia, on the other hand, started an attempt to increase its missile attacks in response to the progress of the Ukrainians in the Zaporizhia steppes. Missile attacks occurred in President Zelensky's hometown of Kryvyi as a result of these attacks, while Russia could not make any significant gains. 3 Ukrainian civilians lost their lives while the Russians were trying to divert the attention of the Ukrainian advance in Zaporizhia in a different direction. Kiev's determined stance on this issue revealed everything. In other words, these striking offensive operations on Ukraine's critical front lines between Zaporizhia and Donetsk seem to be talked about more, despite the efforts of the Russian authorities. So who is in charge of these offensive operations of the Ukrainians? And how are these attacks progressing in such a coordinated way? A key figure in the planning and execution of this operation is Ukraine's 49-year-old commander-in-chief, General Valery Zaluzhny. Although little has been known until recently, his popularity now rivals that of President Vladimir Zelensky. General Zaluzhny, or as his friends and former classmates like to call him, Valery was appointed commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian army in July 2021. Those who knew him well said that the appointment made by President Zelensky himself surprised the general and many others because his promotion only involved climbing a few career ranks. Zaluzhny was already known as an ambitious and modern commander, but he was also a modest man who liked to joke with his subordinates and was not showing off. But what he's currently accomplished in Zaporizhia is no joke. Born into the family of a Soviet soldier, Valery Zaluzhny once stated that he was always determined to distance himself from the extreme hierarchy of the Soviet army. When we look at the battlefield in Ukraine, we can see that Valery Zaluzhny has more than achieved this. So how did this legendary Ukrainian commander succeed in capturing 8 cities in Zaporizhia in such a short time? Lyudmila Ulanovskaya Zaluzhny's former deputy, who has been with him since the first days of the Russian occupation, said in a statement on this subject that the legendary Ukrainian commander hardly sleeps and is in constant communication with the military personnel at the front. Analysts believe that the flexibility displayed by junior officers and the Ukrainian units who can make decisions on the battlefield gives them a significant advantage over the top-heavy decision-making structures of the Russian army. Some sources in the Ukrainian military even go as far as to say that it is the decisive commanders on the ground who are collectively responsible for Ukraine's success. But according to General Zaluzhny, this success can only be achieved if his army leaves its soldiers freedom of operation. In summary, when we examine the structure of the Ukrainian army between the command and the soldiers, we can understand how 8 settlements in Zaporizhia easily got rid of the Russians and why the Russians were constantly unsuccessful on the other front lines, despite their military strength. In other words, volunteering is essential on the road to victory, not necessity. Concepts such as patriotism and freedom overcome all fears and oppression. Does Putin really know how to swim? This is one of the most curious questions these days because all of Putin's war plans are sinking into the sea. Russia is on the verge of a huge defeat at sea. Can Putin, who often poses at sea and boasts of staying underwater for long periods of time, save his country from drowning? Why does the US warship come into the Black Sea? Scare Russia? Why is the Russian Navy panicking? To answer these questions, let's first take a look at how Russia fares at sea. When we look at the map of Russia, we see that most of the country is coastal to the oceans. However, in Russia, which has a very cold climate, the ocean coasts are not very suitable for use because these oceans often freeze. Russia cannot trade using these oceans because if you look carefully at the map, you can easily see that the oceans are too far from the center of Russia. Russia's industrial centers are mostly located in cities near Moscow. Russia cannot use the oceans to sell the products produced in these facilities or to buy raw materials with 17,000 meters squared. Russia is the largest country in the world, and it is very costly to use the highway. Moreover, Russia, the northernmost country in the world, needs ports in the south to trade. Let's look at the map again. The only exit that Russia needs to go southward seems to be in the Black Sea. Since it is not an ocean and is located closer to the equator line, the Black Sea has warm water and the water never freezes. Using this sea, Russia can reach Europe, Mediterranean countries, the Middle East, the Gulf countries, Africa, and India. This vast transportation network is very attractive for Russia. However, it is not that easy for Russia to use this route because there is only one way out of the Black Sea. This is through the Bosporus and Dardanelles Straits in Turkey. The Turkish government controls the passage through these straits as an important member of NATO. Turkey is very careful about Russia's use of the straits. According to international conventions, merchant ships can pass through the straits. But the passage of Russian warships through the straits depends on Turkey's permission. Turkey does not allow the passage of Russian warships. Russia needs to use warships to increase its occupation in Ukraine because the Russian army is suffering a major defeat both on land and in water. The Russian Navy wants to win this war by bombing Ukrainian cities on the Black Sea coast, but they don't have enough navy for that. At the beginning of the war, the Ukrainian army organized a major operation against the Russian Navy. 18 Russian ships were destroyed. This made it impossible for Russia to operate in Ukraine from the Black Sea. So Putin sent his warships to the Black Sea. Russia's largest warships are located on the east coast of the country, because Russia has always kept its warships in eastern ports in case of a war with its historical enemy, the United States. After the sinking of the ships in the Black Sea, the warships in the eastern ports were sent to this region. But the Turkish government did not allow the ships to pass through the straits. The Russian authorities pressured Turkey on this issue for a long time, but the Turkish government was adamant. The Russian warships turned back before they could pass through the Dardanelles. The Turkish government has foiled another Russian plan a few days ago. One of the biggest ships of the U.S. Navy, the USS Nitsy, docked in Istanbul Harbor. It is known that 350 sailors are on board this ship. The arrival of the 155-meter-long giant ship in Istanbul scared Russia. Russia is afraid that this ship will operate in Crimea. US Ambassador to Turkey Jeff Flake went on board the ship and greeted the soldiers one by one. This visit was interpreted as the American ambassador greeting the soldiers to send them to war. The Kremlin followed this visit with great concern. This event was widely covered in the Russian press. Russia is very afraid of losing its power in Crimea. Crimea, which Putin occupied in 2014, is like an island in the Black Sea. Crimea has many natural harbors and is very important for maritime trade. Crimea also has a strategic importance due to its location in the Black Sea. The continental shelf is measured for states to have rights in the seas. The continental shelf of the state that dominates Crimea increases significantly. Russia wants to dominate Crimea in order to have rights to a larger area of the Black Sea because it is thought that there are large natural gas reserves in the Black Sea. The Turkish government found natural gas reserves in 2 different regions in the Black Sea in 2022. Thus, everyone realized that the natural gas reserves in the Black Sea are quite large. However, Russia has been working on this issue for many years. The Russian government wants to be able to explore more areas to extract natural gas resources in the Black Sea. But at the moment, Russia does not have these possibilities. If Russia loses control of Crimea at the end of this war, it will have suffered a very heavy defeat. The Ukrainian government is determined to liberate Crimea. To a question about when this war will end, Zelensky said, "This war started in Crimea. It will end in Crimea." So far, the Ukrainian army has managed to inflict heavy damage on the Russian army with its operations. As a result of further escalation of these operations, Crimea can also be liberated. For this, the support of Western countries is very important. Currently, Leopard 2 tanks will be delivered to Ukraine, but Ukraine needs more. Ukrainian President Zelensky is holding one meeting after another with NATO members. In these meetings, Zelensky says that modern fighter jets should be sent to Ukraine. It is said that NATO members are also very favorable to Zelensky's proposal because it is claimed that if Russia wins the war in Ukraine, it will attack other European countries. This is why NATO members want to send more aircraft to Ukraine, but this will have to wait until the Leopard 2 tanks arrive in Ukraine. The more victories the Ukrainian army wins on the battlefield, the more support NATO members are sending. So far, the Ukrainian army has shown historic resistance and has largely repelled the Russian invasion. The Russian army has been forced to withdraw from most of the territories it occupied in Ukraine. Fighting is continuing right now. The Ukrainian army is shelling Russian positions on many fronts. The Russian army is suffering a heavy defeat at sea, on land, and in the air. According to experts, when this war is over, the Ukrainian army will be able to liberate Crimea. If the war continues like this, the Russian army will not be able to fight in Crimea. What do you think about the operations of the Ukrainian army? What do you think will be the consequences of Russia's defeat in the Black Sea? What do you think about the arrival of the aircraft carrier from the United States Navy in the Bosphorus? Do you think this ship will bomb the Russian Navy? A similar tension between Ukraine and Russia is taking place in the South China Sea. The long-standing tension between Taiwan and China has come to a head in recent months in the midst of provocations such as China's entry into Taiwanese territorial waters and the violation of Taiwan's airspace by Chinese jets. The U.S. has taken a side of this tension thanks to its commercial and military partnership with Taiwan. As the tensions between the two countries started to rise, the U.S. and Taiwan made a series of arms deals aimed at strengthening Taiwan's defense and at least resisting a possible Chinese attack. Thanks to the agreements made in this way, the USA is currently both supplying weapons and training to the Taiwanese army. In addition, the Philippines, a valuable ally of the United States, is also subject to violations by China. The claim of the Philippines in the South China Sea, but China's defense of the entire sea as its own caused an increase in the tension between the two countries. So in this video, we're going to tell you what's going on in the South China Sea. Let's examine together how China, Taiwan, the Philippines, and the USA got into a Mexican stalemate. The United States has expressed support for the Philippines after Beijing violated freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. Senior U.S. officials are on the subject. The U.S. stands with the Philippines in the face of the People's Republic of China. Coast Guard's continued violation of freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. Images and videos recently released in the media are a stark reminder of China's harassment and intimidation of Philippine ships, such as Philippine ships routinely patrolling their exclusive economic zones. The U.S. urged Beijing to stop its provocative and unsafe behavior and said it would continue to monitor these interactions closely. The United States stands with its Filipino allies in maintaining the rules-based international maritime order and reaffirms that no armed attack on Philippine armed forces, public ships, or aircraft can be carried out in the Pacific, including the South China Sea. The statement comes after the Philippines accused China on Friday of using offensive tactics at sea after a Chinese Coast Guard vessel intercepted a Philippine patrol vessel in a disputed shallow area in the South China Sea last week. Both countries claim rights in the disputed South China Sea, where tensions persist between Manila and Beijing. So what was the U.S. move after the statements of the U.S. officials? The U.S. 7th Fleet in the region was deployed to the region between the Philippines and Taiwan. The fact that some ships of the U.S. 7th Fleet went to the region, especially from the Taiwan Strait, was interpreted by experts as intimidating China. After this transition, the Chinese People's Army seemed quite panicked. We can understand this panic from the statements made by China. China has described the passage of U.S. warships through the Taiwan Strait as an exaggerated passage. According to the U.S. Army's 7th Fleet, the Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer USS Milius made a routine Taiwan Strait crossing through waters where freedoms of navigation and overflight on the high seas apply in accordance with international law. The ship passed through a corridor in the Bosphorus beyond the territorial waters of any coastal state. In response, the Chinese People's Liberation Army Eastern Command said it was closely monitoring the warship's passage through the Taiwan Strait. The U.S. Navy has accelerated the passage of a USS Milius guided missile destroyer through the Taiwan Strait, said PLA Eastern Front Command spokesman Senior Colonel E. The same warship sailed in the South China Sea, triggering joint flights of jets and expeditions of Navy frigates by Beijing to monitor the U.S. Navy destroyer. The passage of the U.S. warship through the Taiwan Strait made China realize that it was the U.S. against both Taiwan and the Philippines. The USA attaches greater importance to the security of these two island countries and continues its policy in this direction. These events coincide with Beijing's warning that rocket debris may fall near Taiwan. Taiwan's Ministry of Defense has confirmed that it has detected some debris falling into Taiwan's northern waters. Beijing launched the Fengyun 3G satellite into space over the weekend using its homemade Long March 4th rocket. Taiwan said the satellite's flight path passed over northern airspace. Air traffic in the northern sea regions near Taiwan were also temporarily closed, while China temporarily banned the passage of any ships during the launch. Taiwan's Ministry of Defense said 18 Chinese aircraft and 4 Navy ships were detected around Taiwan. In a statement, it was stated that 4 of the Chinese jets had passed the Air Defense Identification Zone. Tensions between Washington and Beijing continued as the United States accelerated the formation of coalitions in the wider Asia-Pacific region to counter China's expanding military and economic influence. China has recently demanded that the United States immediately cease arms sales to Taiwan and military contact with the island nation. We strongly urge the U.S. side to fully acknowledge the high sensitivity of the Taiwan issue and the complexity and seriousness of the current situation in the Taiwan Strait, said Senior Colonel Tan K-Fabe, spokesman for the Ministry of National Defense of China. The official's remarks come ahead of a visit by a group of U.S. defense companies to Taiwan next week to discuss bilateral defense cooperation issues such as the joint production of drones and munitions. China describes the Taiwan problem as a purely internal matter of China and does not allow any foreign intervention. Representatives from 25 U.S. defense contractors will arrive in Taiwan on Tuesday to attend an industry forum and meet with local officials, according to an unnamed Taiwanese military source. According to China, this move has always been zealous for U.S. military-industrial complexes to sell ammunition, spark conflict and chaos, and make staggering profits around the world. China also described the actions of Taiwan's ruling Democratic Progressive Party as only bringing an untold disaster to Taiwanese citizens and as despicable as putting the cat next to an aquarium full of fish, reiterating that no one or any power can shake the unwavering determination of the Chinese people and will resolutely defend national sovereignty and territorial integrity. The Chinese government urged the U.S. side to adhere to the One China principle. So why exactly isn't China satisfied? China seized the island of Taiwan, which declared its independence as part of its territory. It also urges Washington to abide by the provisions of the three Sino-US joint declarations, deal with Taiwan-related issues, cautiously avoid involvement in the Taiwan issue, and end military contact with Taiwan, as well as arms sales to the Taiwanese region. The People's Liberation Army of China stated that its troops will, as always, pay close attention to the situation in the Taiwan Strait and will always remain on high alert, and warned that they will take the necessary measures in accordance with the law to resolutely counter any attack. Taiwan's independence, separatist activities, and foreign interventions firmly threaten China's sovereignty and territorial integrity, according to the military. China's claim on Taiwan, based on historical foundations and Taiwan's declaration of independence, brought the USA into the middle of this crisis. While the US does not want any tension in the Pacific, the USA stands by Taiwan against the danger of a possible attack by China on Taiwan and the outbreak of a second Ukrainian war. It is not known how long this tension will last, but the tension between the USA and China is the harbinger of a new Cold War.